They're not just looking at you, they're sizing you up. Every move you make in public tells a story, not just about who you are, but how much control you have. And most people, they lose respect not by doing something wrong, but by revealing too much. Machiavelli warned us. Never let them see your weakness. And the Stoics, they mastered the art of silence, stillness, and self-control. Here's the truth. Power isn't about being loud, it's about being unreadable. The less you expose, the more they obsess. But every time you complain, overexplain, or show desperation, you leak power and give others permission to dismiss you. In this video, we'll break down 9 things you must never do in public, and what to do instead. You'll learn how to move like a force people feel, not a presence they forget. If you're ready to stop reacting and start commanding attention, stay with me. And before we begin, hit like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a lesson in quiet dominance. Let's begin.
Number 1.
Never complain. Every time you complain in public, you send an unspoken message to the world. I am not in control. And that one phrase, whether whispered or shouted, rewires how people perceive you. Suddenly, you're no longer composed or commanding. You're needy, fragile, easy to shake. As Machiavelli noted, people align themselves with power, not pity. The moment you express dissatisfaction publicly, you are no longer shaping your reality. You are reacting to it, and worse, you're doing so under the gaze of others, who are silently recalibrating their respect for you. Stoicism understood this deeply. Epictetus, who was born a slave and rose to become one of the most revered philosophers of his age, taught that suffering itself isn't the problem. The problem is our interpretation of the event. When you complain, you're not just describing an obstacle, you're giving it power. You're reaffirming to yourself and others that the situation owns you. And that psychological surrender slowly destroys your internal authority. Every complaint carves a groove in your mind where victimhood becomes the default reaction. And once that groove deepens, it becomes harder to escape the mindset of powerlessness. Now contrast that with the way Marcus Aurelius carried himself. As Emperor of Rome, Marcus could have bemoaned the betrayal of allies, the decay of the empire, or the death of his children. But open his meditations, and what do you find? Not pity, not blame, but clarity, resolve, a relentless focus on what he could control, and silence toward what he could not. He wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." That is the mind of a man who refused to complain, and in doing so, radiated calm in the face of collapse. His composure wasn't just personal, it was political. It sent a message to his enemies, allies, and citizens alike. This man will not break. Fast forward to today, and we are drowning in noise. Digital grievances, passive-aggressive tweets, curated complaints. People treat negativity like a form of connection, a social ritual. They bond over shared frustrations. But here's the hard truth. Every public complaint is a subtraction from your image. It's a moment of uncontrolled emotion captured for others to analyze, critique, or exploit. And it trains the world to see you as reactive instead of sovereign. The more you complain, the more forgettable you become, because your emotional instability blends into the chaos everyone else already brings. However, this doesn't mean you bury your emotions. Stoicism isn't emotional suppression, it's emotional strategy. You feel fully, but you express selectively. You transmute discomfort into direction. Seneca wrote, "Difficulties strengthen the mind, as labor does the body." When you face hardship with silence, calm, and posture, people notice, not because you seek attention, but because your stillness becomes a contrast to the chaos. It earns respect without ever asking for it. Over time, this restraint becomes a force of gravity. People start to notice that you're unmoved by the same storms that rattle others. They sense something different, something stable, grounded, almost unbreakable. And that mystique is what makes your presence powerful. You no longer need to raise your voice because your silence has already spoken volumes. In a world of emotional overexposure, the person who doesn't complain becomes unforgettable. So the next time you feel the urge to vent, pause. Observe it like a scientist, not a storyteller. Ask yourself, will this complaint improve my situation or simply shift the burden to others? Will it build my reputation or chip away at it? If the answer is unclear, choose to remain composed, because every moment of public restraint is a private investment in your image, your clarity, and your inner strength. Never complain, not because you're unfeeling, but because your silence speaks volumes your words never could. That is the mark of a person in command, not just of their public image, but of their own soul.
Number 2.
Never reveal your insecurity. Insecurity is not just a feeling, it's a broadcast. And when you let that broadcast leak into the public eye, everything changes. You go from being seen as composed to being seen as compromised. What begins as a small confession often spirals into a public narrative that traps you. Machiavelli understood this. He wrote that a ruler must appear strong, even when he is not, because perception often outweighs truth. When others sense uncertainty in you, they begin to see opportunities, not to help you, but to surpass you. We live in a world that glorifies authenticity, but that word has been corrupted. What people often mean by authenticity is public emotional exposure, an endless cycle of confession, insecurity, and validation. Yet the Stoics saw things differently. Seneca warned that we suffer more in our imagination than in reality. When you verbalize your insecurity, you're not being more real. You're reinforcing an illusion. You're confirming a fear that may have had no power until you spoke it aloud. Words once released become weapons, and often they're used against you. Instead of exposure, the Stoics taught examination. Epictetus urged us to ask, what is within my control, and what is not? Insecurity is not weakness. It's a signal, but it's a signal meant for you, not for public consumption. When you reveal it prematurely, you shift the power dynamic. You go from being a person of mystery to a person of fragility. And in the public arena, fragility invites pressure, not compassion. Take Leonardo da Vinci, an icon not just of genius, but of poise. Throughout his life, he faced mockery, neglect, and repeated rejection from powerful patrons. But nowhere in his journals, nowhere in his letters, do we find him broadcasting his insecurity. Instead, we find relentless curiosity. He turned his uncertainty inward and used it to fuel discovery. That's the model. Transform self-doubt into silent growth. Let the world wonder, not worry about you. Now here's why this matters more than ever. In the modern attention economy, vulnerability is often used as a brand. People showcase their fears, not to resolve them, but to get applause for having them. But what's applauded today can be used against you tomorrow. When someone knows exactly where you doubt yourself, they don't need to attack you. They just need to remind you, and your own insecurity will do the rest of the damage. But there is another way, the Stoic way. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If it is endurable, then endure it. If not, stop complaining." That is the voice of someone who refused to identify with every passing emotion. He knew that internal storms don't need to become external displays. You ride them, you learn from them, but you do not let them define your image. So when insecurity rises, observe it with discipline. Ask, what triggered this? Is it rooted in truth or just a shadow of past rejection? Then act, calmly, clearly, without explanation. Confidence isn't about never feeling weak. It's about refusing to collapse in front of an audience. When you walk into a room, you owe no one your turmoil, What you do owe them is presence. In public, carry yourself as someone whose world does not crumble with criticism. Keep your voice steady. Let your eyes meet theirs without hesitation. Speak less, but with more weight. Not to dominate, but to show that you do not fear your own silence. Because when you no longer need to be reassured, people start to see you as someone they can't shake. Never reveal your insecurity. Not because you'll never feel it, but because you've trained yourself to handle it where it belongs. In private, in stillness, and in strength. That's how you become unreadable. That's how you build a reputation that can't be rattled by perception. And that's how you walk through the world, not needing to be seen, but impossible to ignore.
Number 3.
Never boast about your plans. When you talk too much about your plans, you don't just share ambition. You leak power. Boasting gives the illusion of momentum without the discipline of execution. It creates a false sense of progress, rewarding you with attention and applause, but leaving your actual goals exposed, diluted, and delayed. Because once your plans are public, they are no longer yours. They belong to the noise. They invite critique, jealousy, resistance. And worse, they hand your rivals a roadmap of your next move, one they can prepare for and block. Machiavelli understood this deeply. He warned that power often belongs to those who act without announcing, who influence without exposure. The most effective rulers did not declare their strategy. They allowed results to speak for them. And by the time their enemies reacted, the outcome was already set in motion. To move in silence is to own the element of surprise. It is to remain unpredictable, and in that unpredictability, to become untouchable. The Stoics embraced a similar truth. Epictetus wrote, "Don't explain your philosophy, embody it." That means speak less, demonstrate more. When you boast about what you will do, you shift your focus from doing to convincing, and that shift creates weakness. You begin performing for approval rather than acting from clarity. You dilute your energy across audiences rather than concentrating it into outcomes. Let's look at a real example. Steve Jobs. He wasn't just a visionary, he was a master of mystique. He didn't parade every prototype or idea before it was ready. He worked behind closed doors, guarding not just intellectual property, but psychological leverage. The result? When Apple launched a product, it didn't feel like a proposal. It felt like destiny, because there was no debate, no negotiation, no build-up through talk, just execution, just impact. There's a deeper psychological mechanism at play here. Studies in behavioral science show that when you talk about your goals, your brain registers the talking as progress. You feel accomplished, even if you've done nothing. This is called social reality. And while it feels good, it drains urgency. You become addicted to the feedback, not the follow-through. Over time, you build a reputation, not as a doer, but as a dreamer who never delivers. And then there's the practical risk. When you boast, you give others time to plan around you, to block you, to undermine you. Even people who admire you may unconsciously begin to doubt you. Because words create expectations, and unmet expectations create disappointment, even resentment. In that gap between talk and reality, your credibility quietly erodes. Over time, you become noise, and the world tunes you out. Now consider Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the known world, and yet he never used his journal to boast. He wrote to remind himself of virtue, focus, and discipline. Not once did he outline grand strategies for others to admire. His greatness was forged in silence, maintained in solitude, and revealed only in the integrity of his daily choices. He didn't signal what he would do. He became the thing he spoke of internally. So what should you do instead? Protect your ambition like a sacred fire. Guard it from wind, from noise, from early exposure. Let your work announce itself when it's unignorable. When someone asks what you're building, respond with clarity. not detail. You don't owe them a forecast. You owe yourself the freedom to adapt without explanation. This silence builds mystery. It grants you space to evolve without public pressure. And most importantly, it strengthens your resolve. Because the less you speak, the more you act with intention. You move from being seen to being felt, from promising to delivering, from potential to presence. Never boast about your plans, not because they aren't meaningful, but because meaning matures best in silence. You are not here to be predicted. You are here to be remembered. And when your actions arrive without warning, the world is forced to pay attention.
Number 4.
Never take public sides in petty conflicts. In public, your presence is currency. And every time you enter a petty dispute, you spend some of it, often without return. What may seem like a small act of loyalty or righteous defense quickly becomes a permanent mark on your reputation. You might win the moment, but you lose something far more valuable: your neutrality, your mystery, and your ability to operate above emotional noise. Because once people see that you can be baited into trivial battles, they stop seeing you as a leader and start seeing you as just another reactive player in the chaos. Machiavelli warned about this dynamic. He advised rulers to never involve themselves in conflicts where there is nothing to gain. Even if one side appears morally right, aligning yourself openly can trap you in alliances that restrict your flexibility. The moment you pick a side publicly in a low-stakes dispute, you create unnecessary enemies. You inherit someone else's war, and worst of all, you become predictable. And once predictable, you become easy to manipulate. People learn your triggers, they steer your emotions, they shape your reputation while you think you're just defending it. The Stoics understood this truth from a different angle. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You always own the option of having no opinion." That's not indifference, that's discipline. He believed that constantly reacting to small matters erodes your focus, drains your energy, and clouds your ability to see what truly matters. Petty conflicts become traps for the ego. You start defending your identity, not your purpose. And in doing so, you drift further from reason. The still mind becomes noisy, the clear path becomes crooked. A modern example of this restraint is Oprah Winfrey. Despite facing countless public attacks, criticisms, and controversies over decades, she rarely engages. She doesn't defend herself in gossip columns. She doesn't clap back on social media. She protects her focus. She builds. She rises above. And because of that, her influence remains timeless, rooted in clarity, not conflict. People respect her not just for what she says, but for what she refuses to say. Now consider the opposite. A person who inserts themselves into every argument, who posts reactionary, takes on every minor controversy, who always has something to say. They may be seen, but they are not respected, because eventually their presence feels chaotic, loud, predictable. They are not followed, they are consumed. And in a world that drowns in opinion, the person who withholds theirs gains power. The less you react, the more others lean in. Not to argue, but to listen. So what should you do when conflict arises? First ask, what do I gain by entering this? Is this a battle for truth or just a performance for attention? Often the wisest response is silence, not avoidance, but elevation. You step back, not because you're afraid to speak, but because you refuse to be pulled into a fight that steals your time and offers no reward. You become a watcher, not out of detachment, but out of deep awareness. You see the game for what it is, and you choose not to play unless the stakes are worth your peace. This doesn't mean you lack values. On the contrary, it means your values are too sacred to be wasted on spectacle. You express them in your actions, your presence, your restraint. You choose when to speak with precision, and in doing so, your words carry weight. Not because they are loud, but because they are rare. The world doesn't need more noise. it needs examples of calm in the storm. Seneca once wrote, "What difference does it make how much you have? What you need is not more, but less." The same applies to your involvement. You don't need more opinions, you need fewer distractions. The more you conserve your energy, the more powerful you become. Never take public sides in petty conflicts, not because you don't care, but because you care too much about the battles that truly matter. Let others fight for dominance in the shallow end. You build your strength in still waters, silent, deep, and unmoved.
Number 5.
Never show hunger for attention. The moment you chase attention, you admit something quietly devastating, that your value depends on being seen, and the danger of needing to be seen is that you become easier to control. The person who hungers for attention doesn't act. They perform, they exaggerate, overshare, and stretch their identity to fit whatever draws the most eyes. But in doing so, they lose the very trait that makes people magnetic: mystery. Machiavelli warned that those who cannot command must perform, and performance, when done for validation, is weakness dressed as charm. It may dazzle in the short term, but long term, it signals dependence. The truly powerful don't announce their greatness, they embody it, they enter a room and say nothing, and yet everyone adjusts themselves in response. Why? Because the aura of self-containment is rare, and in a noisy world, silence signals strength. The Stoics understood this deeply. Epictetus said, "If you wish to be good, first believe that you are bad," meaning begin in humility, work in privacy, and let time reveal the outcome. True growth is quiet. It doesn't broadcast itself at every stage. If you need the world to notice your discipline, then it's no longer discipline, it's performance. And when your practice becomes a performance, your power is no longer your own, you've leased it to applause. Consider someone like J.D. Salinger. At the height of literary fame, he withdrew completely from the spotlight. No interviews, no signings, no self-congratulation. He let his work speak for him, and that silence became legendary. Decades later, people still talk about him. Why? Because restraint is unforgettable. It suggests that something deeper is happening behind the scenes, and human nature is drawn to what it cannot fully access. Now compare that to the modern performer, the influencer who documents every meal, every tear, every fleeting success. Their presence is constant, but quickly forgotten, because when you offer everything, people value nothing. You become entertainment, not influence, noise, not signal. And the cost of constant exposure is spiritual burnout. Because the more you need to be seen, the less you remember who you are when no one's watching. But there is another way, a Stoic way. Instead of chasing the spotlight, become the source of gravity. Don't raise your voice. Deepen your presence. Don't seek more eyes. Strengthen your stillness. Your power isn't in being noticed, it's in being felt. Quietly, completely, without demand. When your energy becomes self-contained, people lean in. Not out of politeness, but because they sense something real. This path isn't easy. We live in an era that equates visibility with value. People are rewarded for sharing every thought, every pain, every private process. But true mastery rejects this model. True mastery grows in silence. When you stop needing an audience, you start earning something greater, command of yourself. So practice moving without updates. Let your actions exist without applause. Refine your craft in private. Let your success come as a surprise. Because the less you need validation, the more powerful your movements become. Not performative, not desperate, but deliberate. Seneca wrote, "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more, who is poor." The same applies to attention. If you crave it, you're already empty. But if you release it, you become full, solid, grounded, clear. You don't perform to be seen, you act to become unignorable. Never show hunger for attention, not because you don't care about impact, but because you've chosen a deeper form of influence, one that grows in silence, moves with intention, and lasts far beyond the moment. Your goal is not noise, your goal is presence, and presence, when earned through stillness, speaks louder than anything you could ever say. Number 6, never break under pressure. Pressure doesn't just reveal your character. It defines your presence. In moments of stress, people either expand into clarity or collapse into chaos. And the truth is, the world is always watching. The way you handle pressure sends a message, even if you say nothing. It tells others whether you're a center they can anchor to, or a liability they need to tiptoe around. When you break publicly under pressure, when your voice trembles, your posture collapses, your gaze darts, you transmit more than emotion. You expose a gap in self-command, and once that gap is visible, it's difficult to close. Machiavelli understood that power often rests not in having all the answers, but in being unshaken when no one else does. He warned that fear spreads fast, and that weakness, once sensed, invites challenge. But the one who remains composed in chaos, that person becomes more than a man. They become a reference point, a landmark in other people's storm. The Stoics understood this at a soul-deep level, Epictetus taught. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Pressure is inevitable, but panic is optional. The Stoic trains not to escape hardship, but to meet it with structure, with stillness, with a mind that sees clearly, even when the heart races. The goal isn't to eliminate emotion, it's to prevent emotion from eliminating clarity. And that clarity becomes your advantage in a world where most people default to reaction. One man who lived this principle fully was Nelson Mandela, 27 years behind bars, deprived of freedom, status, and voice. And yet, when the cameras appeared, he stood tall, shoulders back, eyes calm, words measured. That posture, rooted in inner peace, made him unbreakable. People followed him not because he shouted, but because he remained composed when others would have shattered. He turned restraint into leadership, suffering into structure. Today we're taught the opposite. We're encouraged to share every doubt, every fear, every discomfort in real time. And while expression has its place, chronic emotional leakage weakens the system. It teaches the mind to seek relief instead of strength. And strength, like a muscle, only grows under resistance. If you always release the pressure outward, you never learn how to convert it into force. You forfeit transformation for temporary relief. And that's a costly exchange. So what should you do instead? Build inner rituals of return. When the heat rises, return to your breath. When the noise spikes, return to your posture. When fear visits, return to observation. Don't argue with the moment, witness it, and then choose your action, not for comfort, but for control. That single habit of pausing before reacting transforms chaos into clarity. And in public? Even more important, do not let others read your nervous system. Keep your movements minimal, your breathing slow, your speech clean and firm, because when you remain still while others shake, you earn a new kind of influence, not the influence of charisma, but the influence of calm. You become not just respected, but trusted, and that trust makes people listen without needing volume. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it." That simple shift in perspective allowed him to shoulder the weight of an empire without being swallowed by it. He met pressure with philosophy, emotion with discipline, And in doing so, he proved that composure is not a personality trait. It is a trained response. So never break under pressure, not because you're numb, but because you've taught yourself to stay rooted in storms. Because in a world obsessed with noise, your stillness becomes a rebellion, a quiet force that doesn't need permission to lead, a presence that speaks before you ever say a word. Number 7, never over-explain yourself. The moment you begin to over-explain, you surrender the frame. You move from leading the conversation to defending your place in it. And once you begin defending, people no longer hear your point. They start questioning your position, because over-explanation rarely stems from confidence. It comes from insecurity, a subtle need to be understood, validated, or forgiven. But here's the deeper truth. Explanation is not always clarification. Often, it's an unconscious apology for existing. And when you explain too much, you're not adding credibility. You're subtracting presence. Every extra sentence becomes a negotiation of your own worth. And in that negotiation, you lose power. Not because you're wrong, but because you sound like you're unsure. And unsure voices don't influence. They just echo. Machiavelli warned that once your enemy knows you're seeking to justify yourself, they know they've struck a nerve. Explanation in the wrong hands becomes ammunition. It tells others what matters to you, and by extension, how to rattle you. But when you stay brief, composed, and unbothered, you offer no hooks. You give them nothing to grab onto. And in that quiet refusal to explain, you project something most people lack. Inner stability. The less you say, the more weight your words carry. Silence, when held with strength, becomes a shield. The Stoics called this restraint, Seneca wrote. A wise man is content with himself. He doesn't over-explain because he has nothing to prove. He is led by internal clarity, not public confusion. He understands that a short, grounded response, delivered with calm, often holds more power than 10 minutes of emotional elaboration. Why? Because the calm speaker doesn't just speak, they shape the emotional atmosphere. Their silence feels intentional, their presence feels earned, and most importantly, their words arrive from a place of inner stillness, not outer performance. Consider Bill Belichick, one of the most successful coaches in NFL history. His interviews are famously short, no drama, no long explanations, just measured words, delivered with total disinterest in whether the media understands or agrees. His detachment gives him psychological leverage. He doesn't allow public narratives to shape him. He shapes his own. And because of that, his presence commands attention. Even when he barely speaks, he's not performing, he's not proving, he's simply grounded. And in that groundedness, there's strength. Now contrast that with the chronic explainer. They justify every choice. They clarify every move. They flood the space with detail, trying to erase doubt. But the more they speak, the more they reveal uncertainty. And eventually, it's not their point. People question. It's their person. The attempt to clarify ends in collapse. Their presence becomes fragile instead of final. Their voice begins to tremble, not audibly but energetically. So what's the Stoic response? Practice purposeful brevity. Say only what is essential, then stop. Let silence settle. Let discomfort pass without needing to soothe it. You don't owe people a backstory for every decision, nor a thesis for every boundary. You owe yourself presence, and presence is never born from over-talking. It's born from inner stillness. The man who speaks with control earns more gravity than the one who floods the air with reasons. This isn't arrogance, it's discipline. It's the quiet ability to resist the urge to prove, persuade, or explain to everyone you meet. The Stoics didn't write for applause. They wrote to clarify their own minds. Their power came not from convincing others, but from understanding themselves. And once you understand yourself, the need to explain fades like fog under sunlight. In public, this restraint becomes magnetic. When you speak less, people hear more. When you don't justify yourself, you become hard to corner, hard to predict, hard to control. You create closure, not confusion. You draw focus, not noise. You become someone whose silence unsettles and whose words land like stone. So never overexplain yourself, not because you're indifferent to perception, but because you've trained your perception to matter more, because you've stopped performing clarity and started living it. And that kind of mastery, delivered without apology, will echo long after you've said nothing at all. Number 8, never reveal bitterness toward rejection. There's a moment just after rejection that defines everything. Do you collapse into resentment or do you rise into refinement? Most people make the wrong choice. They reveal their bitterness, they sulk, they lash out, or they scramble to prove their worth too quickly. And in doing so, they lose something more important than approval. They lose their mystique, because nothing destroys presence faster than emotional leakage. Once people can see how rejection shapes your mood, they know exactly how to shape your confidence. You've handed them the remote control to your dignity. Machiavelli wrote that a prince must not be too affected by the favor or disfavor of others. His strength must lie in appearing unmoved. Not because he's cold, but because being visibly wounded makes him manipulable. If people sense that rejection unbalances you, they will use rejection as leverage. They'll delay you, ignore you, exclude you, just to watch you break your posture. But if rejection rolls off you like water on polished stone, they lose that weapon, and you gain something rarer than affection: emotional sovereignty. The Stoics called this detachment. Epictetus taught that we must concern ourselves only with what is within our control. Other people's acceptance, outside your circle of power, their opinions, not your business. Your response to being overlooked, entirely yours. Rejection, to a Stoic, is simply data. It says more about the moment or the other person than it does about your identity. What matters isn't whether you were chosen, but whether you remain composed in the face of being passed by. Now consider Maya Angelou. She faced professional rejection, personal abandonment, and profound betrayal throughout her life. But she rarely spoke with venom. She never let rejection reduce her poise. In her poem, Still I Rise, she responds to rejection not with rage, but with rhythm, grace, and unapologetic presence. She didn't grovel. She didn't curse the world. She smiled, stood up straighter, and moved forward. And in doing so, she became unforgettable. Not because she avenged rejection, but because she refused to wear it. Bitterness is a seductive poison. It feels righteous, it feels real, but it weakens the soul. It traps your identity inside one wound and convinces you the wound is who you are. It pushes away people who might have returned. It dulls your light and makes your worth conditional. Meanwhile, detachment isn't indifference. It's discipline. It's learning to hold the sting without letting it change your character. It's the ability to say, I felt that, but I don't need to show it. So how do you build this inner stance? First, expect rejection. Not because you're doomed, but because you're real. Not everyone will resonate with you, and that's okay. If your sense of self depends on being universally accepted, you're forever at the mercy of strangers. Second, study your reactions. Do you stew in silence? Do you try to win people back? Or do you breathe, recenter, and walk on with calm, collected dignity? And third, turn rejection into ritual. Every time someone says no, don't resist it, reframe it. Take a long walk. Journal one sentence of gratitude for what was cleared out. Use the rejection to sharpen your mission. Let it guide you back to yourself, not away from yourself. And in public, never let bitterness touch your tone. Speak gently of those who overlook you. Smile when you're passed by. Let others wonder what's fueling you instead of knowing what hurt you. Because once they know you're wounded, they stop respecting your strength, they stop seeing your edge, and start sensing your ache. The man who can be rejected and remain radiant is the one who becomes untouchable. Not because he's immune to pain, but because he's mastered the art of rising without resentment. And in a world addicted to external validation, that kind of man becomes rare, remembered, and quietly revered. Number 9, never publicly criticize someone more powerful. It may feel like courage, it may feel like truth-telling, but when you publicly attack someone with more status, more reach, or more influence than you, it rarely ends in justice. More often, it ends in your exile, not because you were wrong, but because power doesn't play fair, and once you challenge it in the open, it sees you as a liability to be handled, not a voice to be heard. Even Machiavelli warned against this misstep. A prince, he said, must be feared more than loved, but never hated. Why? Because hatred invites desperate reactions. The moment you criticize upward, you risk creating not clarity, but a vendetta. And if the person you confront controls the room, the crowd, or the narrative, you've already lost, not through logic, but through leverage. Now, this doesn't mean you become a coward. It doesn't mean you tolerate deception or fold in the face of injustice. But it does mean you move with calculation, not impulse. Because the strongest messages are not shouted. They are whispered where it counts. They ripple beneath the surface. A clever man doesn't wrestle the lion in broad daylight. He studies the terrain, he learns the pattern, and when he does strike, it's never emotional, it's surgical. The Stoics understood this with depth and discipline. Marcus Aurelius, a man with near absolute authority, rarely used his position to publicly humiliate others. In his private writings, what we now call meditations, he reflects on human weakness, ego, and the nature of vice. But he rarely names names. Why? Because his focus was self-purification, not public condemnation. He knew that public criticism often hardens people. It doesn't convert them. It corners them. It fuels pride, not reflection. Real power doesn't perform. It prepares. It restrains. It watches. It moves only when the odds are tilted. That's why Marcus constantly returned to one guiding question. What is within my control? His answer was never someone else's downfall. It was always his own composure. Now consider Oprah Winfrey. She's been attacked, slandered, and mocked throughout her career, but rarely does she retaliate in public. Why? Because she understands that her presence is louder than any rebuttal. Each success, each refusal to react, adds weight to her silence. She doesn't need to destroy her enemies. She simply outlasts them. And that longevity becomes its own kind of revenge, one that doesn't corrode her spirit. So when someone more powerful acts unjustly toward you, pause, ask yourself, what is my endgame? Do I want public revenge or private resolution? If it's revenge, you've already fallen into the trap. Anger clouds vision. But if it's resolution, you must move with clarity. Use influence, not indignation. Influence flows in quiet rooms, through subtle gestures, strategic alliances, and long patience. Second, guard your identity. Don't let yourself become known as the person who's always calling others out. Even if your cause is righteous, that constant noise will make people tune you out. Presence is power, but only if it's preserved. And finally, remember, power doesn't always need to announce itself. Sometimes it watches, it waits, and then it moves when silence has done its work. That's the Stoic way, not because it lacks fire, but because it channels it with precision. In public, keep your criticism clean, or keep it silent. Let others destroy their reputations by overreacting. You ascend through restraint. You influence through mystery. You remain untouchable not by attacking, but by remaining centered when provoked. Because when you challenge power from a place of presence, not pain, you become the kind of force no one sees coming. But everyone remembers when the dust settles. You don't need to raise your voice to raise your value. You don't need to be loud to be respected, and you don't need to win every moment to win the room. What you need is restraint, precision, a posture that says, I don't need to prove anything because I've already proven it to myself. These 9 rules are not just about power, they are about peace, about protecting your presence in a world that constantly tests it, about building a reputation that is silent, strong, and impossible to fake. So as you move through life, remember this: your mystique is your armor, your calm is your signal, and your discipline is your edge. Now, if this message resonated with you, like the video, if you're building your strength in silence, subscribe for more Stoic strategies that help you move smarter, speak less, and lead with presence. The world is watching. Give them nothing to use and everything to remember.